1899 Virginia, Elizabeth Monroe was born into wealth that shaped the lives of those around her. Her family name carried weight across the county. Doors opened at her arrival. Eyes followed her every move, and respect was automatic. Yet for Elizabeth, respect was not enough. From her earliest days, she observed people with a calculating patience. She noticed weaknesses, desires, and fears, storing them silently. No one suspected the quiet ruthlessness growing within a girl who smiled too easily, spoke too politely, and listened too attentively. Her parents indulged her in ways that most children could only imagine. Every whim was met, every request fulfilled, and every question answered. From toys to tutors, from servants to social outings, Elizabeth had everything, but with each gift, each indulgence, she learned another lesson about control. That lesson was subtle at first: how to make someone do exactly what she wanted without asking, how to bend the smallest human impulse to her favor. By the time she was 10, Elizabeth had already begun shaping the household. A small smile here, a tiny disappointment there, unnoticed but deeply felt by those around her. By her early teens, Elizabeth's quiet manipulations had grown bolder. Servants were tested with impossible tasks. Relatives were encouraged to trust her judgment while she slowly undermined their confidence. She never raised her voice. Confrontation was crude and ineffective. Instead, she applied the softest pressure in the exact place it would hurt most. A forgotten errand, a mismanaged task, a misread expectation. Each became an opportunity. Those who failed even slightly felt confusion before frustration, a sense that the fault lay somewhere they could not reach. Elizabeth watched silently, measuring reactions, learning whom she could control and how far she could push them before resistance began. The town of Virginia offered the perfect stage. Gossip traveled fast in small communities, and reputation was currency. Elizabeth understood the network of whispers, the invisible bonds of obligation and fear, and she used it meticulously. A slight insult left unchecked here, a misstep quietly amplified there, and she built an invisible web that trapped those around her. No one could point directly at her. No one could accuse her of cruelty. Yet everyone knew deep down that disappointment, exhaustion, and quiet humiliation followed her like shadows. By the age of 20, Elizabeth had become a figure of admiration in public and terror in private. Her smile, so easy and disarming, could hide a strategy meant to control servants, manipulate friends, or unsettle family members. A young maid might find herself overworked, then blamed for minor mistakes, not by word, but by Elizabeth's subtle withdrawals, less attention, a fleeting frown, a delay in reward. A distant cousin might be coaxed into taking a risky financial step, only to be quietly denied access to funds or support. Every action was invisible in intent, but profound in consequence. The wounds she inflicted were silent, slow, and enduring. Even her romantic endeavors followed the same pattern. Young men drawn to her, charm found themselves trapped in carefully constructed emotional scaffolding. Elizabeth encouraged affection and trust, but she refused intimacy without leverage. She demanded small proofs of loyalty, subtly undermined independence, and left invisible chains on those who thought themselves free. Few realized until much later how completely their lives had been influenced by her designs. By then, the scars were permanent. What made Elizabeth truly dangerous was her patience. She never sought quick victories. Instead, she built dependency slowly, nurturing trust only to twist it. A friend who relied on her for advice might slowly realize that every decision she encouraged had served only her advantage. A neighbor who accepted a small favor might discover, too late, that obligations had quietly piled up, a debt not financial, but social and emotional, impossible to repay. Every micro-choice, every subtle disappointment reinforced her authority. Her control extended to the smallest details. Clothing, timing, seating arrangements, even the tone of her voice were tools of subtle dominance. Guests at a dinner might leave feeling slightly off balance, a sense they could not name. A servant might obey her command perfectly, yet still feel inadequate. Elizabeth understood that cruelty did not need to be loud. Its quiet, precise execution left deeper wounds than any open confrontation. By the end of her early 20s, the first cracks in her community were already appearing. Families whispered about broken ambitions. Servants resigned in silent despair, and neighbors tiptoed around her influence without ever confronting it. Elizabeth moved through this world as if untouched, admired and charming. Yet every interaction left invisible marks. A careful observer might notice it. The small hesitations, the subtle sighs, the quickened pulse when she entered a room, but no one could accuse her of wrongdoing. Elizabeth's rise was silent, methodical, and nearly invisible. She had discovered the art of cruelty without exposure, dominance without spectacle. The early years of her adulthood were a period of quiet accumulation, trust converted into leverage, loyalty into tools, and admiration into subtle fear. The foundations were laid. Those who would later suffer most were already within her grasp. And yet, even as she perfected her quiet empire, the future whispered of consequences she had not yet seen. In this small Virginia town, life moved slowly, measured by the seasons and the whims of those in power. Elizabeth's moves were imperceptible, yet every shadow she passed, every smile she offered left its mark. The invisible scars of her early manipulations would grow, unnoticed for years, and in the quiet corners of her world, where no one dared speak, those she touched would learn in time the depth of her calculated cruelty. By 1900, Elizabeth Monroe had established herself as a force within her small Virginia community. Her early manipulations had matured into a carefully maintained network of influence. Every servant in her household understood the unspoken expectations, though few ever realized how they had been crafted. Minor errors were punished not by words but by withdrawal, a withheld glance, a delay in acknowledgement, a small task given at inconvenient hours. These punishments were subtle, invisible to outsiders, but their effects were profound. Morale eroded quietly, trust faltered, and obedience became an instinct rather than a choice. Neighbors who once admired Elizabeth found themselves slowly ensnared in her influence. Invitations to social events, casual conversations, or requests for advice became calculated measures of control. One widow, eager to maintain favor, followed Elizabeth's recommendations for investments, unaware that each suggestion increased her dependence. Another family, proud of its independence, found itself repeatedly in minor financial or social embarrassment, all orchestrated through Elizabeth's careful nudging. The cruelty was never public, never dramatic, yet the consequences were relentless. Elizabeth's charm was a mask that hid an exacting mind. She would smile while subtly undermining a confidant, nod politely while planting seeds of doubt, or appear empathetic while measuring another's insecurities. The townspeople, accustomed to her grace, rarely questioned her motives. By the time suspicion arose, the damage had already been done. A young maid who once felt proud of her work might leave the Monroe estate feeling inadequate, anxious, and drained, unable to articulate why. A neighbor might feel an unexplained sense of discomfort in a familiar room. Elizabeth's cruelty was like a ghost, intangible yet impossible to escape. Even her romantic entanglements were instruments of influence. Suitors drawn by her beauty and reputation were encouraged to invest emotionally, only to be guided subtly into dependence. A gentleman might be persuaded to make a small financial commitment, a personal sacrifice or a social compromise, believing it was for love. Yet these concessions were never for her affection. They were for her control. Over time, the pattern became clear to the few who paid attention. Elizabeth cultivated trust and then exploited it with precise cruelty. By 1902, whispers of her subtle manipulations had begun to circulate. Not openly, for no one dared challenge her publicly, but in hushed tones behind closed doors. Servants spoke of minor injustices. Families mentioned inexplicable misfortunes, and friends quietly withdrew from her influence. Elizabeth noticed these murmurs, but she saw them as further proof of her control. Each whisper, each subtle reaction became data, evidence of how effectively she had established her web. Her cruelty extended beyond immediate interactions. A minor scandal involving a distant relative could be twisted and magnified, her involvement invisible. Elizabeth's hand guided events, yet she left no trace. People suffered consequences, yet could not identify a cause. Over time, her neighbors' lives became tangled in chains of dependence, doubt and quiet suffering. She created a reality where her authority was invisible, yet absolute. Even the smallest details mattered. Elizabeth observed the timing of conversations, the tone of a voice, the sequence of a letter. A servant's hesitation could be interpreted as disloyalty, a child's nervous glance as guilt. Every movement, every hesitation, every unspoken word became a measure of control. By the end of her early 20s, Elizabeth's presence alone was enough to unsettle a room, though no one could explain why. Her cruelty was methodical, almost surgical. She measured, observed, and adjusted. Those around her felt fear, not of her anger, but of her unpredictability. A kind word today could be followed by cold indifference tomorrow. Nothing was consistent except the subtle weight of her influence, a constant pressure that wore down resilience and morale alike. Elizabeth had learned the quiet power of anticipation, the ability to make others guess her intentions, to leave them perpetually on edge. By the time she reached 24, the Monroe estate had become a microcosm of her influence. The servants moved in silent obedience, neighbors sought her favor nervously, and friends hesitated before offering trust. Each life she touched carried traces of her manipulation, yet outwardly she remained charming, admired and untouchable. Her cruelty, though silent, had become systemic. Those who fell into her web rarely escaped unchanged, and yet, even at the height of her subtle dominion, there were glimpses of inevitability. Some whispered of the isolation that such control demanded, the loneliness born from superiority and manipulation. Few, if any, understood that the quiet suffering she imposed on others would one day reflect back upon her. The seeds of regret, though invisible now, had already been planted. By 1903, Elizabeth's presence had become a quiet force throughout the town. She moved among neighbors, acquaintances, and employees with an effortless grace, yet every interaction carried subtle intent. Few could articulate it, but her influence left a sense of unease. Conversations were carefully navigated. A pause here, a fleeting glance there, and she had already shifted the course of a person's day. The young maid, the distant cousin, the ambitious neighbor, all operated under invisible constraints, unaware of the precise threads guiding their choices. Her cruelty had matured into a pattern. Tasks assigned to servants were increasingly unreasonable, yet framed as ordinary expectations. A chore left incomplete was met with no overt reprimand. Instead, the subtle withdrawal of acknowledgement, or a measured frown communicated disappointment far more effectively. These small, almost imperceptible punishments accumulated over time. By the end of the week, morale was diminished, confidence eroded, and a sense of inadequacy had taken root. Each individual carried the invisible weight of her expectations, though she never needed to raise her voice. Among the wealthier families, Elizabeth's influence extended through subtle manipulations of social favor. Invitations were granted or withheld, rumors hinted and vanished, and trust was carefully guided. A widow might invest in a local venture at Elizabeth's suggestion, only to discover that her influence had created dependency rather than support. A neighbor's pride could be quietly undermined by minor slights, orchestrated to appear accidental. Each event seemed natural, coincidental or misinterpreted, yet they all traced back to her deliberate orchestration. Romantic interests were no exception. Men drawn to her charm and beauty were encouraged to reveal personal hopes and weaknesses. She listened attentively, smiled reassuringly, and then allowed their vulnerabilities to become leverage. Promises were elicited, minor sacrifices requested, and decisions guided, always under the guise of affection. By the time they recognized the manipulation, the damage had been done. Trust had been converted into control, affection into dependence, and subtle cruelty had left permanent marks. Elizabeth's cruelty was not loud, but it was pervasive. Even small social interactions carried consequences. At gatherings, a misplaced comment or delayed acknowledgement could shift reputations. Servants noticed favoritism one day, coldness the next, and learned to navigate the shifting expectations with silent obedience. Neighbors felt minor discomforts, unexplained frustrations, and subtle losses that eroded confidence over months. Each slight, unnoticed by outsiders, compounded into a landscape of quiet suffering. In the household, the system of control was intricate. Tasks were layered, instructions ambiguous, and rewards contingent upon behaviors she rarely acknowledged. A young maid's devotion was repaid with micro-adjustments that slowly eroded pride and self-assurance. A junior servant attempting independence was subtly trapped by obligations no one else could see. By the time dissatisfaction surfaced, the subtle chains were firmly in place, invisible yet unbreakable. Even casual conversations were carefully managed. Elizabeth could plant suggestions that seemed harmless, only for them to unfold into minor crises. She monitored responses with meticulous attention, noting hesitation, discomfort, or eagerness, and used these to further refine her influence. The subtle shifts in behavior among acquaintances became a quiet game of cause and effect, her control extending into corners she never needed to touch directly. By 1905, her reputation as a figure of charm and refinement remained intact. Yet beneath the surface, her subtle cruelty had begun to define the town's social rhythm. Individuals adapted to her expectations, often unknowingly, as small failures accumulated. Families learned caution in speech and action, employees walked on eggshells, and friends hesitated before offering trust. The weight of her influence was constant, though imperceptible to most. Even the simplest gestures were employed as tools. A well-timed compliment, a brief nod, a casual request, each designed to adjust perception, influence action, or test obedience. No overt hostility was needed. Subtlety ensured compliance more effectively than confrontation ever could. Every person around her learned that small errors carried consequences not openly stated, and the anticipation of disappointment became a tool of quiet control. Despite her growing dominance, there were hints of inevitability in the patterns she created. The town's reliance on her guidance, the psychological chains she imposed, and the slow accumulation of resentment foreshadowed future fractures. Those who were quietly suffering began to recognize the source of their unease. Though the consequences were subtle and delayed, the seeds of eventual retribution were planted even in these early years. By the end of this period, Elizabeth had perfected a network of subtle dominance. Her power was invisible yet absolute. Every individual in her orbit carried traces of her manipulation, quiet dissatisfaction, unspoken frustration, diminished pride, and a lingering sense of inadequacy. She remained admired, envied, and untouched by criticism, while the town itself became a silent testament to her methodical cruelty. Even in isolation, she never acted carelessly. Each interaction was calculated, each reaction measured. Small victories were accumulated over months, invisible but profound. Those who fell under her influence were rarely aware of the extent of her control until the consequences were undeniable. By now, her early experiments in quiet manipulation had grown into a sophisticated web. Every gesture, every word, every choice was a potential instrument of subtle cruelty. And yet the inevitability of fate lingered in the background, though none could foresee it. The suffering she imposed, the dependencies she cultivated, and the quiet resentments she inspired would one day converge. The seeds of regret, though still invisible, were being sown. Elizabeth's empire of quiet cruelty was complete, but the first hints of its eventual consequences were already beginning to stir. like shadows at the edge of a carefully lit room. By 1906, Elizabeth's influence had begun to cast tangible shadows over the lives she touched. The subtle manipulations of previous years had compounded, leaving emotional fissures in families, households, and friendships. Servants moved with a quiet tension, aware that even minor missteps could result in a withdrawal of attention, a fleeting expression of disappointment, or the silent imposition of an additional task. Though no one outside the Monroe estate could witness these small punishments, the consequences were clear in the daily weariness and lowered morale of those under her control. Neighbors, too, felt the subtle pressure. Invitations were carefully rationed, advice was selectively offered, and small social slights were orchestrated to reinforce dependence. A man seeking favor found that a casual disagreement might result in weeks of hesitation or delayed acknowledgement. A young widow, eager to maintain her standing, followed Elizabeth's recommendations, only to discover that her compliance had increased obligations she had no authority to refuse. Each action seemed natural or coincidental, but it was always guided by Elizabeth's unseen hand. Her cruelty, methodical and precise, now had cumulative effects. Individuals who had once approached her with trust or admiration began to feel the weight of quiet oppression. Children of families she influenced grew anxious under her indirect control. A servant's confidence eroded after months of small corrections, subtle delays, and silent judgments. Friends and acquaintances learned to anticipate her moods, carefully measuring every word and gesture. Even the simplest interactions carried the risk of disappointment or manipulation, and the psychological toll was undeniable. Elizabeth's mastery of social nuance ensured that her actions remained invisible to casual observers. A delayed smile, a careful word choice, or the silent omission of a favor could create a cascade of discomfort. One family discovered that their reputation in town had subtly declined, a result of minor miscommunications Elizabeth had encouraged. The family could never identify the cause, and yet they felt the consequences in whispered conversations and lost opportunities. In this way, her cruelty became systemic, pervasive, invisible, and inexorably effective. Romantic engagements continued to serve her designs. Young men who believed themselves beloved found their emotions and actions guided without consent. Minor sacrifices were requested, personal ambitions were subtly discouraged, and dependency was carefully cultivated. The charm that had drawn them remained, but behind it lay the precise architecture of manipulation. By the time the men recognized the pattern, they were bound emotionally and socially. Their autonomy eroded without notice. Each relationship left invisible scars, a testament to the quiet, calculating cruelty that had become Elizabeth's defining feature. Even casual gestures within her home and social circle were instruments of subtle dominance. A compliment might be given at one moment, and a cold omission at another, ensuring that those around her remained uncertain, vigilant, and compliant. Servants measured every movement. Neighbors considered each conversation, and friends hesitated before offering trust. Each small psychological pressure reinforced a larger system of control, one that few could perceive and none could resist. By now, the town itself had begun to feel the ripple effects of her subtle tyranny. Families who had once thrived under mutual respect and cooperation now moved cautiously, their decisions influenced by anticipation of Elizabeth's reactions. Opportunities were declined, ambitions restrained, and voices silenced, not by threat of punishment, but by the persistent expectation of disapproval. Her power was invisible yet absolute. Elizabeth observed all of this with the precision of a careful architect. Each reaction was noted, each hesitation catalogued, each sign of anxiety stored for future use. Her cruelty was never impulsive. It was carefully measured, refined over years of observation. The consequences she orchestrated were long-term, designed to leave traces that could not easily be erased. Each person who fell under her influence carried the mark of her subtle hand, whether in quiet resentment, diminished confidence, or hidden despair. Even in her private moments, Elizabeth continued to refine her methods. She noted the smallest gestures, a servant's glance, a neighbor's hesitancy, a friend's forced smile. She tested limits and boundaries, adjusting expectations and timing to ensure maximum effect. Her cruelty had become a science, applied with care and precision. Yet masked beneath charm and grace, those closest to her were most affected, often without realizing why. By 1908, the first visible consequences of her influence were emerging. Families began to fracture under pressure. Servants left their positions exhausted and demoralized, and neighbors hesitated to act without her guidance. The town's social landscape had shifted imperceptibly, but irrevocably. The ripple of her actions spread wider than she ever intended, touching lives in subtle, inescapable ways. And yet, even as her empire of quiet cruelty expanded, the inevitability of fate lingered. The subtle injustices she had planted were seeds that, over time, would bear consequences she could neither control nor predict. Though admired and envied, she remained unaware of the slow, quiet forces gathering beyond her influence. The groundwork for regret, long deferred, had been laid. Elizabeth's world, once carefully controlled, had become a network of dependence, fear, and silent suffering. Each gesture, each word, each calculated omission ensured that those around her were bound to her will, even as they began to sense the weight of her quiet tyranny. In her hands, life itself had become a mechanism of subtle cruelty, a system so refined that none outside her immediate circle suspected its true depth. By the end of this period, the consequences of her early manipulations were undeniable. They were invisible to the casual observer, yet their effects were real, pervasive, and lasting. The town had begun to bend under her influence, a quiet reflection of the power she wielded, without ever raising her voice. The lives she touched were forever altered, and yet, even in this height of silent control, the first stirrings of eventual justice, subtle and unavoidable, had begun to take shape. By 1909, the effects of Elizabeth's subtle cruelty had spread beyond her household, shaping the rhythms of the entire community. Servants who had once moved with tentative confidence now tread lightly, anticipating small disappointments that could arise at any moment. Their days were filled with minor tasks layered upon one another, each designed to keep them uncertain, anxious, and compliant. Even a minor error was magnified in her mind, leaving the individual burdened with guilt and unease long after the immediate incident had passed. Families under her influence began to show signs of strain. Minor disagreements were intensified by her interventions, letters misdelivered, conversations redirected, advice subtly twisted. The result was a slow, invisible erosion of trust. Parents quarreled over inconsequential matters, siblings doubted one another, and friendships frayed without any outward cause. The quiet cruelty that had begun years earlier now had a compound effect. Those who had once relied on Elizabeth's guidance increasingly found themselves lost in a web of confusion and anxiety. Elizabeth's interactions remained outwardly charming. Her smile, effortless and disarming, continued to conceal the precise manipulations behind each gesture. A simple compliment could disguise a test. A polite suggestion could carry a hidden expectation. Each action reinforced the psychological control she had cultivated for years. She had learned that overt cruelty might invite rebellion, but subtle, consistent pressure ensured compliance and dependence without resistance. Romantic relationships followed the same pattern. Young men, captivated by her beauty and perceived affection, were drawn into careful dependency. Emotional investments were converted into social and financial leverage, and autonomy was quietly undermined. Each promise of devotion came with an unspoken obligation. Each gesture of kindness concealed a test of loyalty. By the time these men recognized the subtle constraints placed upon them, the emotional impact had become deeply ingrained, leaving scars that would endure for decades. Even casual observers could not fully perceive her influence, but its effects were everywhere. A neighbor's pride diminished incrementally, a family's social standing subtly altered, a servant's confidence quietly eroded. These were not sudden or dramatic consequences. They were gradual, almost imperceptible, yet they were cumulative, forming a tapestry of quiet suffering that defined life in Elizabeth's orbit. In the Munro household, her cruelty had become methodical. Tasks were layered, instructions intentionally ambiguous, and minor successes or failures carefully noted. Servants learned to anticipate disapproval, to temper initiative with caution, to walk a delicate balance between obedience and discretion. One misstep could result in days of silent observation, a cold glance, or a withheld opportunity, punishments, invisible to the casual eye but devastating in their emotional impact. Social gatherings offered another arena for her subtle tyranny. She could isolate individuals with a carefully placed word, encourage dependence through strategic praise, or leave them feeling inadequate with a fleeting expression. Friendships shifted, alliances formed and dissolved, and the community itself began to revolve quietly around her influence. Those under her sway were aware of discomforts they could not explain. Outsiders saw only Elizabeth's charm and poise. By 1910, the weight of her influence was unmistakable. Families hesitated to act without her guidance. Employees moved with extreme caution, and friends deferred to her judgment, even when it conflicted with their own sense of right. The town's social order had adapted to her presence, bending subtly to accommodate her expectations. Elizabeth's cruelty was both invisible and absolute, leaving a trail of quiet suffering that few could identify, but everyone could feel. Even minor details became tools of control. A subtle pause, a brief smile, a carefully timed question, each reinforced uncertainty and compliance. Servants learned to anticipate these cues. Neighbors hesitated to speak freely. Friends measured each gesture. Every interaction reinforced her authority and maintained the psychological web she had woven over a decade. The long-term impact was already apparent. Children in the household she influenced exhibited anxiety and hesitation. Adults experienced chronic uncertainty, and relationships began to fray under pressure. The quiet cruelty, meticulously administered over years, had transformed the emotional landscape of the community. What had begun as small, isolated manipulations had become systemic, a town subtly reshaped by one woman's precise hand. And yet, in the midst of her dominance, subtle signs of vulnerability appeared. The very isolation required to maintain control meant that few truly understood her, and fewer still could offer counsel or companionship. The weight of responsibility, the constant observation, and the careful orchestration of influence carried its own toll. Though it remained hidden behind her charm and poise, the first hints of the consequences she would one day face were emerging, invisible to all but the most perceptive. By the end of this period, Elizabeth's empire of quiet cruelty was complete. The lives she touched carried the marks of her influence, permanent and often unrecognized. Dependence, anxiety, and subtle suffering were woven into the social fabric, a testament to her methodical, invisible power. And yet, beneath this success lay the seeds of inevitable return, the quiet, inescapable weight of fate that would one day touch even her. By 1912, Elizabeth's influence had reached its zenith. The town, the families, the servants, even distant acquaintances, all moved in patterns she had orchestrated. Her presence alone dictated behavior. A smile or glance from her could shift the trajectory of an entire household. Yet, the same mechanisms that had solidified her control were beginning to isolate her. Those who had once depended on her admiration or guidance now avoided her gaze. Invitations grew scarce. Whispers circulated with increasing caution, and subtle mistrust began to accumulate around her carefully curated persona. The very networks she had constructed for dominance became barriers. Friends, once eager to please, began to distance themselves, sensing the invisible weight of her manipulations. Servants who had endured years of her subtle tyranny now left quietly. refusing confrontation, but taking their dissatisfaction elsewhere. Each departure, each minor loss of influence, was a ripple in the web she had built, weakening structures she had assumed unassailable. Her cruelty, which had once been entirely invisible, now carried unintended consequences. Families fractured beyond repair. Some marriages ended quietly. Some ambitions were permanently stifled, and minor betrayals emerged where control had failed. She observed these events with detached curiosity, unaware that the failures were not isolated but symptomatic of the very system she had perfected. The town's social fabric, once pliable to her manipulation, began to resist her subtle pressures. Romantic relationships, the instruments of her control for over a decade, began to reveal their fragility. Men who had invested in her, charm and perceived affection, now recognized the extent of their entrapment. Emotional dependence, once invisible, became a source of frustration and resentment. Small confrontations, previously avoidable, emerged from cracks in loyalty and trust. The emotional leverage she had cultivated for years began to waver, as subtle defiance and hesitation spread quietly among those who had once been bound entirely to her will. Even daily interactions became precarious. A servant's glance no longer guaranteed compliance. A neighbor's hesitation now hinted at unspoken resistance. Subtle manipulations, once effective, began to encounter the limits of human endurance. Elizabeth noticed these shifts, but failed to adjust adequately. Her meticulous planning had accounted for obedience, not for the slow accumulation of resentment and withdrawal that now quietly challenged her authority. By 1914, cracks had widened. Those closest to her, friends, allies, employees, now moved with caution, not out of respect but out of wariness. Even casual gestures, once instruments of control, carried risks. A misjudged word, a slight misunderstanding, a delayed acknowledgement could provoke unanticipated tension. The psychological environment she had engineered for compliance and dependence had transformed into a landscape of uncertainty. Suspicion and quiet defiance. Isolation compounded the problem. Elizabeth's dominance required constant observation, careful calculation, and precise timing. Over years, she had invested every social and emotional resource into maintaining her subtle empire. Few could approach her without caution. Fewer still could offer honest counsel. Those who had once provided companionship now acted with reservation, leaving her increasingly solitary despite her public charm. The very tools that had created power, manipulation, observation, control, now fostered solitude. The first tangible consequences of her cruelty became apparent. Former servants, emboldened by distance, recounted incidents of unfair treatment. Families, long constrained by subtle social pressures, began to assert independence in small but meaningful ways. Romantic entanglements, carefully orchestrated, dissolved quietly but irreversibly. Each small act of resistance, whether subtle or overt, marked the beginning of a reversal in the dynamics she had meticulously maintained. Even Elizabeth's reputation, once untouchable, became vulnerable. While admiration persisted in public, whispers grew more persistent in private. The careful construction of her persona, graceful, intelligent, in control, began to show cracks. Observers noted inconsistencies, hesitations, and unexplained moments of frustration. Subtle irony, once entirely hidden, began to emerge. The architect of suffering now faced the quiet threat of her own isolation and the first stirrings of retribution. Her own reflection, both literal and social, became an arena of unease. The realization that influence could not entirely prevent resistance, that manipulation could not fully control free will, began to surface in private moments. Tasks that once demanded obedience now required careful negotiation. Conversations that once flowed predictably were now fraught with uncertainty. The silent empire she had built, invisible yet absolute, now bore the first marks of impermanence. By the end of this period, the foundations of her control were still intact, but their edges had begun to crumble. The town moved carefully, influenced yet wary, aware yet uncertain. Elizabeth's cruelty, though still effective, had begun to encounter natural limits. Psychological tension replaced absolute obedience. The first echoes of consequence, the quiet, inescapable weight of fate she had long deferred, were now tangible. Her rise had been complete. The first whispers of decline were unmistakable. The inevitability of return, the subtle justice of years spent manipulating others, lingered in the background. Those who had endured her silent tyranny were not yet fully free. But the groundwork of accountability was forming. Her isolation deepened, her influence faced resistance, and the quiet empire she had built over a lifetime of calculation began, imperceptibly, to show the earliest signs of unraveling. By 1916, the quiet empire Elizabeth had spent nearly 2 decades constructing had begun to collapse. The subtle threads of influence she had woven throughout her household, her social circle, and the broader town had started to unravel. Servants no longer hesitated at the edges of obedience. They left, silently refusing to participate in the intricate games of expectation she had perfected. Friends who had once deferred to her judgment now avoided her altogether, speaking cautiously, if at all, and keeping their distance. The admiration she had cultivated remained, but it was now tinged with suspicion, discomfort, and an unspoken unease that could not be erased. The consequences of her earlier manipulations were visible at last. Families she had subtly controlled now resisted her suggestions openly. Marriages constrained by her influence showed cracks long concealed. Ambitions she had diverted were pursued elsewhere. And minor betrayals she had previously orchestrated surfaced quietly but unmistakably. Individuals who had lived under her guidance began to reclaim autonomy, exposing the fragility of the control she had assumed permanent. The invisible web she had relied upon for domination was fraying. Thread by silent thread, romantic entanglements, once carefully guided into dependency, now fell apart under scrutiny. Men who had sacrificed ambition, independence, and personal pride for her, favor began to confront the subtle oppression she had imposed. Emotional leverage, previously absolute, dissolved in the face of awareness and resistance. Those who had once been bound by invisible chains now recognized the depth of manipulation they had endured. The affection Elizabeth had used as a tool now returned as a mirror, reflecting the calculated cruelty she had relied upon. Even her public persona, long untouchable, began to show cracks. Whispers spread more freely. The polished image of charm, intelligence, and grace was marred by subtle inconsistencies, fleeting frustrations, and moments of impatience. Where once she had moved with the unchallenged confidence of someone whose influence was absolute, she now encountered hesitation, quiet defiance, and silent questioning in every room she entered. The weight of decades of cruelty had begun to return, imperceptible at first, then unmistakably. Within the Monroe estate, her former servants became witnesses to the unraveling of control. Tasks previously obeyed without question now met resistance, whether through deliberate delay or subtle disregard. The meticulous system she had created to manage every interaction, every glance, every gesture, had become vulnerable to human independence. Confidence, once carefully eroded, began to return to those around her. Pride, long suppressed, now resurfaced quietly but decisively. Elizabeth observed this, and for the first time, the precision and predictability she had relied upon faltered. By 1918, the isolation she had cultivated as a necessity for control became a tangible burden. The very people who had once served as instruments of influence, friends, family, servants, acquaintances, now turned away, hesitant, distrustful, or indifferent. The charm and charisma she had used as camouflage could not mask the consequences of decades of psychological manipulation. The solitude she now experienced was not relief, but a reflection of the relationships she had quietly fractured. Her world, meticulously controlled for years, had narrowed into a space of observation without compliance, guidance without obedience, and command without effect. The broader town felt the echoes of her past cruelty. Families that had endured minor fractures over the years now confronted the long-term consequences openly. Ambitions once quietly stifled were pursued with renewed vigor. Relationships previously constrained by subtle manipulation were redefined. And while Elizabeth remained a figure of historical prominence within her community, the aura of unchallenged authority had dissipated, replaced by a cautious respect tinged with awareness of the harm she had caused. Even in her private reflections, the inevitability of fate became apparent. The subtle suffering she had imposed upon others returned in echoes of regret, isolation, and missed opportunities. Friends who had once deferred, servants who had once obeyed, and lovers who had once been entangled now existed at a distance, indifferent to her charm and untouched by her control. The emotional consequences of her own strategies, meticulously avoided for decades, had finally converged. She was left with the awareness of what she had done, and with the realization that the suffering she had cultivated would not be hers alone to administer. It was now mirrored back, quiet, inescapable, and persistent. By 1920, Elizabeth was a shadow of the figure who had once moved with precise dominance across Virginia. Her charm remained, but its effect was diminished. Her influence fractured, her control undermined. Those around her who had once bent to her subtle tyranny now acted with independence, and the social structures she had relied upon to enforce compliance no longer yielded to her subtle pressure. In quiet corners of her world, the consequences of her cruelty had fully returned, not as dramatic justice, but as the slow, unavoidable erosion of influence, respect, and connection. Even as she aged, the memory of her manipulations persisted in the community. The psychological traces she had left in the lives of others endured far beyond her own immediate perception. Families she had subtly controlled, friends she had influenced, and individuals she had entrapped carried the evidence of her cruelty in minor fractures of trust, caution in communication, and the quiet assertion of autonomy. Elizabeth had ruled silently for years, but now she was governed by the very principles she had used to govern others. Her final years were marked by reflection, a quiet awareness of the inescapable return of fate. The subtle web she had woven over decades, designed to ensnare others invisibly, had left her isolated, observed, and constrained. The psychological consequences she had once administered with precision now became a mirror, solitude, regret, and the realization that influence could not permanently bend the will of others. She endured as she had forced others to endure, the slow passage of time and the inevitable reckoning of consequences long deferred. In the end, the life she had, meticulously controlled, for decades became a testament to the principle she had long ignored, that the cruelty imposed upon others, no matter how subtle or invisible, eventually returns. The town, shaped quietly by her influence, now moved beyond her dominion. Those who had suffered under her subtle manipulations healed and reclaimed agency. And Elizabeth, once the architect of silent tyranny, experienced the quiet, inescapable weight of fate that her own hands had set in motion.